Welcome back to part two of the PowerPoint, the one that Pearson gave me the skeleton of, and I've been kind of playing around with it. We're in part two here, which is the number two. Actually is a good memory aid because we're getting into a time which is 200 BC to 200 AD, and this is called the Han Dynasty. You will, because of your Western heritage, you will be thinking that this is the time of the biblical stories about Jesus and the forming of the church, and 200 years before and 200 years after. But China is isolated in many ways, not every way, but in many ways, and they're continuing with their own drama, and there is a lot of drama. Now, these days, if you are listening to the business news, you will hear about a new Silk Road. And China is trying to become a player in the world, trying to become one of the great powers. And they have attempted to reach out to new markets. And some of these markets are in India, and then some of them jump across to Africa. And the Silk Road that they're building now is a combination of railroads and highways and ferry boats, all designed to speed Chinese-made goods and services from China towards Africa. Many years back, 2,000 years ago, they had a Silk Road, and the Silk Road went from central China and it went up through Pakistan and Afghanistan, and it went through the Middle East, and it terminated in Venice. So people in what we like to think of as kind of our historical neck of the woods, Rome, Greece, early European countries, they actually bought silk that was made in China. Silk was a national treasure, and it was so important to the Chinese economy that if you stupidly revealed the secrets to silk making to anyone outside of your Chinese culture, it was a capital offense and you would be put to death. So silk and jade, incense products, these were things that Rome wanted. They were making togas, and you could make a toga out of homespun, or you could make a toga out of the finest silk from China. How did it get there? It went by camel caravan across deserts, donkeys. It was like a relay race. A certain set of transportation people, maybe people with camels, they would take the goods for 300 or 400 miles, and then they would stop and turn around after having given the next group of transporters their goods. So there were a lot of middlemen in the whole thing, So the price of the goods kept getting steeper and steeper, but you got to remember that there was royalty and there were people with big budgets who could afford to have these things. So maybe between China and Europe, there would have been maybe 4 or 5 different carriers, and each one of those carriers had to be concerned with not really pirates, but they had to be concerned with outlaws, uh, bands of raiders who, in low parts where civilization was sparse, they could descend upon one of these little trading caravans and they could steal all these things for themselves and then resell them. So the politics, you know, the traders had to pay off people who were threatening them. It was a pretty fancy operation, but it was called the Silk Road. And what historians like about it is that it was also an opportunity for the two cultures to intermingle. In India, you saw that the Buddha was wearing Roman toga type of thing. So you're going to find that even though so many miles separated these two cultures, you're going to find that there was actually some interactions between them. But Chinese had the attitude that they were superior to everybody else, so they didn't work too hard at exploring beyond their bounds. It says this is 11:07 in your Ravel, and what I'd like you to do is really use the zoom in button on this and study. It's about a lady who was like a princess or a queen, and she was buried in this piece of woven tapestry. If you look really carefully, you'll see scenes from her life, and it will tell you something about this time period. Today, people think of Confucianism as a religion. They don't understand that it is not a religion. It is a tradition. It is a cultural set of norms, something like law, that has been adopted by Chinese people as health giving to society. Confucianism is like a set of etiquettes, and it talks about a hierarchy of rulers and people who are workers and what kind of respect they should pay to each other. And within the family, who is, the old people are to be revered, men to be revered more than women. There's the Confucianism is kind of the backbone of the how do you manage disputes? How do you manage government? It's a code, kind of like a code of ethics. I was just reading one of the papers that talked about early forms of religion, and do they disappear or do they stick around? Taoism is a real early form of Chinese religion, and it is nature oriented. So if you hear the wind going through the trees in the mountains and you're a Taoist, you envision the backbone of the mountain as a large dragon, and you envision the trees as scales on that dragon. And when the wind blows through them, you're hearing the sounds that dragons make when they move around and rustle. A little waterfall will have its own spirit. It'll have its own God. It's a very pantheistic kind of religion, and it is a religion. It has some books, and it has people who write poetry about this religion. It is, I was just reading that it was said that Confucianists are public about their Confucianism, but in their private lives, they're more connected to the older belief of Taoism. So it's a very important thing even today in Chinese culture. Tombs were furnished with all sorts of beautiful objects, and I noticed that the book talks about some tombs that the Chinese know about and they haven't opened them yet, but certain tombs have been opened, and I think the earlier video that I put up shows them opening up certain tombs and taking out all sorts of wonderful objects of art. You've looked at Egyptian art that was done in registers, bands of narrative. So you have probably a procession that is going into the palace, and it's like a cartoon strip, and the story just keeps going from one to the next to the next to the next, and snakes up. This would be kind of an example of Confucianism in art because it is about palace visits, it's about decorum, who to bow to and when to bow, and it's very orderly. And I think I told you that during a dynasty, life could be very orderly and very pleasant, but in between these dynasties, there would be periods of tension. So nothing of Han architecture survives except for these little models. And if you can think of this as a full-scale house, first and second century Common Era, so right around the time of Jesus, 100 to 200 AD. That's a pretty nice house. You have a courtyard here. You have the entranceway that can be shuttered against. This was a place that had to be fortified because you didn't want bandits sneaking in. You had an open courtyard here, and then the different stories and different bedrooms, and probably a study. Each room had a certain purpose to it. Now, talking about a dynasty in trouble, the Han Dynasty disintegrated, and then you had this period of time, 6 dynasties, and you had 3 warring kingdoms. You can read and you can see that there were changes to what life in China was like. When a dynasty went down, people retreated if they could. Intellectuals went to their country homes and they wrote poetry and they painted pictures with their calligraphy and with their brushes. And they didn't want anything to do with the cities and the palaces because a lot of times they could lose their life if they got involved in it. So sometimes there's this escapist element, and it's like, I'm just going back to my country home and sit out 10 years or 20 years until things settle down. Buddhism came in here. So this is, again, a kind of a Confucianist piece, which is talking about how to live a life around a court where there's rulers that need to be addressed in certain ways. I put in a video earlier about calligraphy because it's in some ways it's more important than pictures in China. How you write can be a real reflection of your own personal style. So people like the master calligrapher in the video, people can spend their whole lives at learning to make expressive symbols and characters, and it's writing is the embodiment of thought, and we don't give much notice to that. We sit down at a keyboard and we just go tap, 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 and we have a very standard look to our writing. But in China, when you want to say something, not only do you want to communicate what it says, but you also want to overlay your own personal spiritual side or enhancement to your writing. So calligraphy is very, very important in China. And I do have to tell you that it's fun to try, and it's very challenging because these people make everything look so easy. And when you hold a brush in your hand and you try and make these marks, it's usually a pretty rough go to start with. Doesn't mean you shouldn't try it, but you should have the right equipment. You should have the right bamboo brush, right kind of ink, the right kind of paper, and it would help you to have a teacher. Every year they have a Chinese festival. It's down around the library downtown, and there is a booth where they have kind of like a Chinese education group, and they have opportunities for visitors to sit down and have a little calligraphy lesson with somebody who knows what they're doing. So it seemed like it was January or February. Again, I doubt that they'll have it this year because of COVID, but you never know. So keep your eyes open for opportunities to attend Chinese festivals, and maybe you'll find somebody who has brushes and paper and directions on how to proceed. Along the Silk Road and along the trading routes in the south, there were gigantic sculptures, Buddhist sculptures that were made. And this is one example. It's in the northern part. It's kind of cut into the face of the cliff so that it's, in a sense, it's like cave art. Look at the size there, 45 feet tall. That's quite a statement. So we're going to end here, and there will be a part 3, and you'll see that the the 3 kingdoms came to an end, and we're going to have the Tang Dynasty come in, and we'll be doing that in part 3. Tang people, strong and vigorous, and they were also traders on the Silk Road.